Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into a barrel-aged Scotch ale. This one is from Black Raven Brewing Company and it is Splinters. Clocks in at 10.8% ABV and has been barrel-aged in Westland Distillery whiskey barrels for 6 months. So, Black Raven Brewing Company is based in Redmond, Washington. This is a beer that I've had different years release. It was either the 2018 or the 2019. They rotate through different barrels. I think the last one I had was a bourbon barrel-aged version. This is a straight whiskey barrel. Don't know if it's the same distiller providing the barrels, but it's always nice to try beers that you've had before on a New Year's release where they're changing things up just to see how they compare. Now, Scotch ale's one of my favorite beer styles, a nice big heavy beer. Not the most popular style by volume. They're a little harder to find. So when I see a good Scotch ale pop up, I'm gonna grab it. So in terms of label art, I honestly think this looks very similar to how it did on the last one. It's got kind of their logo on it, very clean design, gives you some kind of info about the barrels they used. And there's a little spiel on the back as well. Also really cool artwork on the back there. I'm a fan. Artwork is always nice, whether it's something funky or just a nice, simple, clean design. It does kind of add to the beer experience. So we got this cracked. Gonna get this poured right here. I'm using my porter glass. This is a pretty good glass I found for Scotch ales. Could have used an all-purpose, but it's got a pretty good shape for Scotch ales. Lets it open up. All right. Visually, this looks like a nice Scotch ale. It's a dark brown, got some ambery hues in it. They're normally not super light, not super dark, somewhere in the middle. This one is sitting right in that zone of somewhere in the middle. It obviously formed a pretty nice creamy head on top. And I can tell you, I can see through this, holding this up to the really bright LEDs. There is a very slow, several beads of super fine bubbles shooting up rather slowly, which I presume is one of the reasons it formed this really nice, tight, creamy head. Those nice slow bubbles tend to do that. Does have a pronounced aroma. This is barrel aged. So let's get right up over it for a good sniff. Oh yeah. Yeah. You can smell the maltiness of that Scotch ale malt bill, and you can smell the whiskey barrel really coming off of this quite strongly. It smells exactly what I expect. And there's some elements of this Scotch ale that do kind of remind me a little bit of what you might find in a barley wine. There is some toffee, there is some caramel, and there is some kind of rich dried fruits. I am definitely getting figs, I am definitely getting plums, I'm definitely getting apricots. So I expect in terms of like a nice barrel-aged Scotch ale, this one's going to be quite complex. So let's just jump right in and see what this 2020 release is all about. Oh yeah, that's a nice beer. That's a nice beer. The flavor profile on this is maybe not as intense in terms of flavor intensity as what you might expect, but the flavors that do come through are very complex and they're very layered. There is, of course, up front, a nice little bit of booziness. You can really taste that whiskey. The malt bill does come through very clearly. And as is often the case with many barley wines, it's also true in the case of this specific Scotch ale. That kind of caramel, that toffee, those rich dried fruits that I was picking up in the aroma, that is really translating quite prominently into the glass. So it does have this underlying fruity sense to it, but it's more like a rich, darker fruit that had maybe been baked into some kind of a baked good. It's almost cobbler-like in the way that it presents its fruity flavor profile. For sure it's figs, for sure it's apricots. There's some other kind of underlying kind of stone fruit flavors coming through in there. And it really pairs well with that kind of underlying caramel and toffee sense that is about it. And of course, the whiskey barrel does pair very well with that as well. So overall, the underlying beer that they've made, very nice, very layered. And these flavors just kind of pop one into the next, into the next, into the next, and they all kind of open up and here I am. And they're all just kind of blending together. In terms of the finish on this one, much like the intensity of the flavor profile is not as intense as you might expect for beer, that's barrel aged in particular in this ABV range, the finish isn't anywhere near as long as what you might expect on your average high ABV barrel aged beer. It's very nice. It tastes very, very good, but it just finishes kind of really all the flavors kind of ramp up, they mix together, and then they kind of ramp down, and it's more or less gone. There's just the slightest suggestion of some lingering whiskey on the back, but it's very, very subtle. Overall, the bulk of the flavors that you get up front, they're there and they're gone within about the 20-30 second range. Only a tiny, tiny amount, just a whisper of whiskey remains on the back of the palate. Overall, it's got a very nice flavor profile. It is very complex. It's very wet, very round, but it doesn't really linger around. It's not super, super pungent in your face. So people that like beers that have a lot of complexity, but maybe they don't want quite that intensity that you get with a lot of these high ABV and barrel-aged beers, this might be one that is worth exploring. Very, very tasty. So I'm going to jump back in for a body and mouthfeel. I'm going to let these flavors re-intensify, see if I missed anything. Very nice beer. Body on this one is not as heavy as you'd expect for a Scotch ale at 10.8, almost 11%. It's just medium. I'd expect at least medium heavy, but it's kind of average medium. Yeah, so not quite as robust as you'd expect. Mouthfeel on this, very much a classic Scotch ale. So the body may not present itself as heavily, but the mouthfeel definitely feels the part. It's got a lot of resistance. There's a lot of fermentables in here. Scotch ales do tend to be higher ABV. They do tend to be rather resistant. This one also gets very, very silky, very creamy when you agitate around the palate. So it's got this thickness to it and this real velvety, silk-like quality as you move around the palate. On second sip, yeah, everything that I got in the first sip comes through again. But what I did pick up, some of those underlying stone fruits that weren't kind of apricots and figs that I was kind of trying to figure out what it was I was tasting. And this one, I'm not sure it's stone fruit. It tastes more like almost like a crisp apple, almost like not a Granny Smith, not a tart apple, but more sweet, like a Golden Delicious type. So it's got this nice combination of flavors: fig, apricot, and then this like ripe, juicy apple is coming through, mixed with this toffee, this caramel, that whiskey undertone. It's just a very, very nice beer. Very tasty, tons of layers of flavor, finishes nice and clean. This is just a well-done Scotch ale. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up my scores. When we come back, we'll get this 2020 release ranked from top to bottom. All right, now that we've gotten to enjoy this beer, we're going to get it ranked. Again, this was Black Raven Brewing Company's Splinters, a barrel-aged Scotch ale clocking in at 10.8% ABV. This one was aged for 6 months in Westland Distillery whiskey barrels. Black Raven Brewing Company is based in Redmond, Washington. So starting with the aroma. The aroma on this beer was quite pungent. It's a barrel-aged Scotch ale. You kind of expect it. What I didn't expect on the aroma was it having so many commonalities with a barley wine or a wheat wine or an oat wine kind of aroma profile. There was a lot of underlying caramel and toffee and a lot of rich dried fruit, as well as that whiskey. Overall, it was well above average. The aroma does get a 9 out of 10. For the taste, I really enjoyed the flavor profile on this beer. There were a ton of different layers of flavors and they kept moving in and out of one another. And overall, the flavor I found well above average. What kind of held it back from being top tier for me was just how relatively mild it was. Let alone it's barrel-aged, mild for a barrel-aged beer, but a Scotch ale at almost 11% ABV. Scotch ales are very big, bold, flavor-forward beers, and this just lacked some of that oomph to kind of push it over the finish line for me. It was very nice. What I tasted was very, very tasty, but it was very, very subdued. Flavor profile really didn't have the intensity I expected for this beer style in this ABV range and barrel-aged on top of that. But what did come through was very, very tasty. Overall, the taste gets an 8 out of 10. For the body on this was really just kind of hovering in the middle of medium. It was significantly less broad than you would expect for Scotch ale pushing 11%. I mean, it is what it is. It's just average. Body gets a 5 out of 10. For the mouthfeel on this beer was a completely different story altogether. It was very thick, very resistant, super, super silky, velvety creamy when you agitate it around the palate. It felt like a Scotch ale, and it had the mouthfeel that just didn't match the body. But the mouthfeel itself was perfect. I wouldn't have changed a thing. Mouthfeel does get a 10 out of 10. For the finish, here we come back to kind of the flavor intensity or relative lack thereof. The finish was nice, and it was really just in terms of overall length for the style, hovering in the high end of average range. Without the barrel aging, it really wouldn't have even come close to making it into the average range at all. It just didn't have the intensity to keep those flavors pushing all the way to the end. Overall, high end of average. Finish gets a 6 out of 10. For the head and retention, this one did an absolutely fantastic job. From the beautiful, thick, rich, creamy head stuck around the whole time, head and retention does get a perfect 10 out of 10. For the appearance on this beer was textbook Scotch ale. They can kind of fall in a range. Some are a little lighter, some are a little darker. This was right in the middle in the Goldilocks zone. Appearance does get a perfect 10 out of 10. For the balance of ingredients I really, really appreciated on this beer. The malt bill that they put together was exactly right for the style. Had a lot of intricate flavor layering, the barrel as well, and they all played their part. While it may have not been as intense as I expected for this beer, overall the balance of this was just absolutely top notch. Balance does get a 10 out of 10. Filling in the intangible. Subjectively, I enjoyed this beer. It was a very tasty beer. It just, for me, it really came down to an intensity factor. Subjectively, I enjoyed it. I thought it was above average, but not top tier. Feeling and intangible does get an 8 out of 10, which brings us finally to an example of the style. In the grand scheme of the things, this beer did well. In most categories, it lost a few points in a few, and really where it did lose points were kind of stylistic. So yeah, it's a good beer. It's a good barrel-aged Scotch ale. It's just not maybe the best representative out there in the marketplace. That said, the relative lack of intensity compared to your standard Scotch ale, certainly a barrel-aged version at that in this ABV range, this might be appealing to a lot of different people. As it were, I thought it was above average. The example of the style does get a 7 out of 10, which brings the total score on Black Raven Brewing Company's Splinters 2020 release to an 83 out of 100. So this is definitely above average beer. It always sounds like I'm nitpicking when I'm describing, here's the scores and here's how I came up with them. But it's important for you to get the full picture. What's this beer about? This may not be one that I would probably grab again just for my own drinking pleasure. If I could pick something else or another Scotch ale that is most likely going to be bigger. But it was a very tasty beer. Definitely worth trying at least once. And if you don't like quite as intense of beers on these big high ABV styles, this might be exactly what you're looking for. In the grand scheme of things, it was very tasty and I do recommend it. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, just turn on the notifications, click that bell icon. It is right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.